The rain came down hard on Chicago the night Mara Vasquez learned that her father had gambled away her future. She was standing in the kitchen of their three-bedroom house in Bridgeport, still wearing her scrubs from the hospital where she worked double shifts 3 days a week, when she heard his voice through the cracked door of the living room. He wasn't alone. He never was anymore. Not since the drinking had gotten worse, not since her mother had left, not since the neighborhood had started whispering the name Ricci with the kind of reverence people usually reserved for God and weather. "I need more time," her father was saying. His voice had that particular tremble she'd learned to hate, not because it made him weak, but because it meant things had already gone too far for pride to save him. "Please, I'm asking you. I have a daughter. She works. We can pay Mr. Vasquez." The second voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. It was low, measured, and utterly devoid of warmth. The voice of a man who had never needed to shout because silence from him was already a threat. "You owe Ricci Holdings $230,000. The original loan was $80,000. The interest is what it is. You've had 14 months. I know. You came to us. We didn't come to you. You understood the terms. I was desperate. Most people who come to us are." Mara pressed herself against the wall of the hallway, heart slamming against her ribs. 230,000. She closed her eyes. She did the math in her head the way she always did, the habit of a woman who had been managing household accounts since she was 17. She divided it, multiplied it, stretched it over years. There was no version where it worked. Her father's pension, what little remained after the gambling debts he'd taken out the loan to cover in the first place, would never touch it. Her salary as a surgical technician, decent, not extraordinary, was already carrying the mortgage, the utilities, the groceries. She pushed open the door. There were two of them. One she recognized, Marco Pellegrini, a thick-necked man who collected for various people in the neighborhood and whose presence at someone's door was never good news. The other one she didn't recognize, and that was the one her attention fixed on, the way your eyes fix on the edge of something sharp before you've consciously registered the danger. He was sitting in her father's armchair like it had always belonged to him, long legs crossed at the ankle, a dark suit that fit him the way expensive things fit men who had never had to think about the cost. Dark hair, the kind of Italian black that was almost blue under certain lights. A jaw like someone had carved it out of something that didn't yield. He was maybe 35, maybe older. It was hard to tell with men whose faces had been arranged by discipline rather than softened by comfort. He was looking at her. Not the way men usually looked at her, with the quick assessment of attraction, the inventory taken and conclusion drawn. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, carefully, without rush, cataloguing what was useful and what was not. "Mara." Her father rose from the couch, his face the color of old chalk. "You shouldn't be—" "How much?" she said. The man in the armchair tilted his head slightly. It was the only movement he made. "Excuse me? How much does my father owe you?" She kept her voice steady. She was good at that. Years of OR rooms and trauma bays had taught her that panic was the most expensive thing in the world. 230,000, he said. He said it without inflection, the way you state a fact about the weather. "And the terms if he can't pay." Her father made a sound. "Mara, please, the terms," she repeated. The man studied her for a long moment. Something shifted at the edge of his expression, not warmth, not interest exactly, but a kind of attention sharpened. "The property," he said. "The house. And there are other considerations." She knew what other considerations meant. She'd grown up in this neighborhood. She knew what men like this did when money wasn't available. She knew that her father's hands, the hands that had once built cabinet frames and fixed her bicycle and held her mother's face on their wedding day, were the kind of thing a man like this considered collateral when he ran out of other options. She stepped further into the room. She was aware that she was still in her scrubs, that her hair was pulled back, and she had a coffee stain on her left sleeve, that she was presenting herself in the least impressive way possible to a man who wore a suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. She didn't care. "I'll work it off," she said. Silence. Marco Pellegrini looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. Her father made a strangled noise and reached for her arm. She stepped out of reach. The man in the armchair, she didn't know his name yet, didn't know she would spend the next 6 months learning every inflection of it, uncrossed his legs slowly and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. The position brought him closer to eye level with her, even seated. It was a deliberate movement. Everything about him, she would learn, was deliberate. "Work it off," he repeated, and if she'd expected mockery, there wasn't any. Just that same careful attention. "And what exactly do you imagine that means?" "I'm a surgical technician," she said. "I also have a business administration degree I've never used because the hospital pays better. I can type, I can manage, I can organize, I can run an office. Whatever you need, I'll work it off. My organization isn't a charity project, Miss Vasquez, Mara Vasquez, and I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a job. You give me work, I give you labor, and we offset the debt at a rate you determine. It's a business arrangement." She paused. "Unless you'd rather take a house that's worth maybe 110 on a good day and leave my father with nothing and still be short 120. Something happened in his eyes. It was brief, a flicker, a reassessment. She filed it away without understanding it yet. He sat back. The long fingers of one hand tapped once against his knee, then stilled. "Luca," Marco said, low and cautious. "This isn't—" "Leave us," the man said. Marco went still. Then he nodded and moved toward the door. Her father didn't move. The man, Luca, she thought, Luca, looked at her father with an expression of patient finality. "Mr. Vasquez, give us the room." Her father looked at her with the eyes of a man drowning and handing someone else his life jacket, all guilt and relief braided together in a way that would have broken her heart if she'd had time for it. He left. The room was quiet except for the rain. Luca Ricci, because that was who he was, she would understand later. The Luca Ricci, the one the neighborhood whispered about like weather, looked at her for a long time. Long enough that a lesser woman might have looked away. She didn't. "You understand what my company does," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Enough. And you're not afraid?" "I didn't say that." He almost smiled. Almost. It was the barest movement at the corner of his mouth, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "No," he said. "You didn't." He rose from the chair then, and he was taller than she'd calculated, the kind of tall that rearranged the geometry of a room. "I'll expect you Monday morning, 7 a.m. My assistant will send the address." "You don't have my number." "Miss Vasquez." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He draped it there, She hadn't even noticed, completely at home in someone else's house, and something in the way he said her name made the room feel smaller. I already have everything I need to know about you. The number is a formality. He walked past her toward the door. She didn't move. What's the rate? She said to his back. He paused in the doorway. 2,500 a week, credited against the debt at my valuation of your work. Perform adequately, the valuation improves. He didn't turn around. Welcome to Ricci Holdings, Miss Vasquez. Try not to be late. Then he was gone, and the rain kept falling, and Mara stood in her father's living room with her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. And she told herself the only thing she'd let herself feel about Luca Ricci was calculation. She was wrong, of course, but that would come later. The address was a building on Michigan Avenue that looked like money felt, all dark glass and geometric lines, the kind of architecture that said, "We don't need to impress you," while impressing you entirely. Ricci Holdings occupied the top 4 floors. There was no company sign visible from the street, no directory listing in the lobby. You either knew where you were going or you didn't belong there. Mara had arrived at 6:45. She was not a woman who was late. She wore what she had that was closest to professional. A black blazer she'd bought 2 years ago for a job interview she hadn't gotten, dark trousers, low heels that she could stand in for 8 hours without wanting to die. Her hair was down, which she immediately second-guessed in the elevator, but there wasn't time to fix it. The receptionist on the 42nd floor was a woman in her 50s named Gloria, who had the kind of face that had seen everything twice and found it all mildly amusing. She looked Mara up and down once, and then handed her a badge and a non-disclosure agreement and a pen, all without saying good morning. Mara signed without reading it, which was the most reckless thing she'd done in years, and handed it back. "Mr. Ricci's office is down that hall," Gloria said. "Don't knock. He'll know you're there." Mara walked down a hallway, carpeted in something that absorbed sound entirely, flanked by abstract art she didn't have time to look at, and doors that were all closed. At the end of it, a set of double doors, dark wood, the kind that didn't have handles on the outside. She was 2 feet away when they opened. Luca Ricci was at his desk, and he was on the phone, and he did not look up when she entered. The office was enormous and almost aggressively uncluttered. A desk of black stone that might have been granite or might have been something more theatrical, 2 chairs facing it, a wall of windows with the entirety of Chicago laid out below like an offering. To the left, a long conference table. To the right, a door she assumed led to something she wasn't meant to know about yet. He was in his shirt sleeves. The jacket was on the back of the chair, and the sleeves were rolled to the forearm, and he was making notes with a pen in the margin of something while talking, and the combination of all of it, the ease, the authority, the absolute indifference to her presence, made her feel, for one traitorous second, the specific gravity of a man who had never needed to perform power because he simply had it. She sat down in one of the chairs without being invited to. It seemed like the right move. He glanced up, just once. Something that might have been approval crossed his face so quickly she couldn't be certain. She waited. She was good at waiting. Surgeries had taught her that, too, the particular discipline of being ready without being impatient. He finished the call, set the phone down, looked at her across the expanse of black stone. "You're early," he said. "You said 7. Most people interpret that as 7. I interpreted it as before 7. He considered this. Then he slid a folder across the desk toward her. Your predecessor quit 3 weeks ago. Before that, her predecessor quit 6 months into the job. Before that, how many? 4 in 2 years. What's the actual job? Whatever I need it to be. He leaned back in his chair. I have a chief of staff who handles the operational elements of the business. What I need is someone who manages the administrative layer. Correspondence, scheduling, travel, the coordination of my personal calendar with the organizational one. I also have charitable foundations and real estate holdings that are technically separate entities, but practically require the same person managing their administrative interface. She opened the folder. The job description was dense, 12-point font, 2 pages. She read it. She didn't skim. He watched her read it. You actually read it, he said. Why wouldn't I? The last 3 read the title and told me it looked manageable. Is that why they quit? Because it wasn't? They quit, he said, with the precise weight of a man choosing words like currency, because they weren't suited for the environment. She looked up from the folder. What does that mean? It means that working for me requires a specific temperament, discretion, composure, the ability to function in conditions of incomplete information without requiring reassurance. He paused. It also means not being frightened of me. The directness of it was almost startling. She held his gaze. I'm not frightened of you, she said. I just don't let fear make my decisions. This time she was certain of the expression, not quite a smile, but the shape of one, being considered and set aside. Sit at that desk, he said, nodding toward a smaller desk positioned to the left and slightly behind his own, an arrangement that struck her as both practical and possessive, the way you'd want someone useful kept close. Gloria will send you the access credentials. There's a backlog of 3 weeks of correspondence that needs to be sorted, prioritized, and drafted for response. I'll review everything before it goes out. Everything? Everything. That's going to slow the process considerably. He looked at her. Yes. So the expectation is that I'll earn your trust over time, and the review process will become less intensive. That's one possibility. What's the other? That you'll never earn it entirely, and will work within those parameters. She stood, took the folder, and moved to the desk he'd indicated. It had a clean surface, a high-end monitor, and a small vase with a single stem of something white. She didn't know flowers well enough to name it. She wondered if Gloria had put it there, some small domestic mercy for whoever was starting fresh. She pulled up the email system. 3 weeks of backlog resolved itself into a kind of controlled chaos she recognized from trauma bays. Urgency overlaid on urgency, the important buried beneath the merely loud. She started sorting. They worked in silence for 2 hours. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who were both capable of concentration, and she found, to her own mild alarm, that his presence across the room didn't agitate her the way she'd expected. He was simply there, a point of gravity, and she worked around it. At 9, he said, without looking up. How long have you been a surgical tech? 6 years. Why not go further? Medical school. She kept her eyes on the screen. Couldn't afford it. Still can't. A pause. You managed your father's finances? I've managed this household since I was 19. She said it without bitterness, because bitterness required a luxury of time she'd never had. My father is a good man who has never been good with money or with limits. And yet you're here, paying his debt. Yes. Why? She stopped typing, turned slightly in her chair to look at him. He was watching her with that same unnerving stillness, pen held loosely between two fingers. Because he's my father, she said. Because I can. Because the alternative is watching something happen to him that I can't fix after the fact. Something passed through his eyes, fast, like weather. She couldn't read it. Continue with the correspondence, he said, and looked back at his papers. She turned back to her screen. At 11, Gloria appeared with coffee, 2 cups, one for each of them, placed without comment on the corner of each desk. Mara's had the right amount of cream in it. She hadn't told anyone how she took her coffee. She didn't ask. She already understood, at least in outline, the kind of organization she was inside. She drank the coffee and sorted the correspondence and felt, at the edge of everything else, the specific and inconvenient awareness of a man 12 feet away from her who moved through power the way most people moved through air, naturally, without thinking about it, as if there had never been a world where it wasn't there. She told herself it was just observation, professional calibration, understanding the environment. By noon, she had cleared the backlog, drafted 17 response emails, flagged 6 as requiring his direct review, and created a priority matrix she'd printed and placed on the corner of his desk without being asked. He looked at it, looked at her. "You'll do," he said. She thought, "That's not enough for what I'm giving you." She didn't say it. Not yet. That would come later, too. By the end of the first week, Mara understood 3 things about Ricci Holdings. First, it was a legitimate empire, layered over something that wasn't. The above-board face, real estate development, private equity, charitable foundations, hospitality, was real, generating real money, employing real people who went home to ordinary lives and didn't ask questions. The layer beneath it was what she was not supposed to see, and they were all very careful about what reached her desk and what didn't. She was careful to appear as though she wasn't noticing the careful. Second, Luca Ricci was not simply dangerous in the way powerful men were conventionally dangerous, through ego, through appetite, through the carelessness of the untouchable. He was dangerous in a more precise and therefore more alarming way. He was intentional. Everything he did, he had decided to do. Every silence was chosen. Every word was placed like a chess piece. There was no excess in him, no vanity, no cruelty for its own sake, no performance of strength. He was simply, completely, and quietly in control of everything in his immediate radius. And that radius, she was increasingly certain, extended further than any room she'd been in with him. Third, she was good at this job, better than she'd expected to be, which was saying something because her expectations of herself were already high. The skills transferred, the triage logic of the OR, the ability to read a room's temperature, the discipline of being present under pressure. Within 4 days, she had rebuilt the scheduling system from scratch and presented it to him in the form of a 1-page overview she'd printed and placed on his desk at 7 a.m. He had read it while she was still settling at her own desk. She'd watched him read it in her peripheral vision without turning her head. He hadn't said anything, but that afternoon he had forwarded to her an email he'd previously have handled himself, and the subject line said only, "Yours." She'd taken it as a promotion and not made a thing of it. On Friday of the first week, she met Dante. Dante Ricci was Luca's younger brother, and he arrived in the office like weather arriving, loud, warm, generously proportioned in every direction, wearing a suit that probably cost as much as his brother's, and somehow managing to look like he'd bought it at a market stall and was having the time of his life in it. He was handsome in a way that announced itself immediately and forgot it halfway through the sentence. He had the kind of laugh that was physically impossible to dislike. He stopped in the doorway to Luca's office, clocked Mara at her desk, and turned on a smile like someone throwing a switch. "Well," he said. "Dante," Luca said, without looking up, in a tone that contained an entire manual of fraternal management compressed into 2 syllables. "Brother." Dante crossed the room with the long-strided ease of a man who had grown up in spaces like this and was never intimidated by them. He dropped into one of the chairs across from Luca's desk and crossed an ankle over his knee. Then he turned back to look at Mara with a smile that was entirely without threat and entirely too interested. "And you are?" "Mara Vasquez." She extended a hand across the distance with the calm professionalism she'd been performing all week. "Mr. Ricci's executive assistant." Dante shook her hand and held it perhaps 1 second longer than necessary. "Mara. Is it short for something?" "No." "She's working," Luca said. The words were directed at the papers in front of him, but were clearly intended for his brother. Dante released her hand. He looked at his brother, then back at her, then at his brother again, and something in the look said he'd registered something that Mara herself hadn't identified yet, and found it privately delightful. "I just stopped by about the Venezia thing," he said, settling back. "Tonight." "Tonight, yes. Carmine wants a face at the table, preferably yours." "I'll be there." "And afterward, there's the thing we'll discuss it tonight." Luca's eyes flicked to Mara's direction, brief, conclusive, and she understood without being told that she was being signposted toward the boundary of her knowledge. She nodded slightly, to no one in particular, and returned to her screen. But she heard Dante say, low and amused, as he rose to leave, "She's different." And she heard Luca say nothing. The nothing landed differently than words would have. That evening, pulling her coat on, she found a note on her desk. Not an email, an actual handwritten note on heavy cream cardstock in a handwriting that was spare and precise. "You'll need appropriate attire for client events. Gloria has a budget authorization. Use it." She turned it over. Nothing on the back. She stood with the card in her hand and felt something move through her that she quickly classified as irritation because it was easier than the alternative. She was not a doll to be dressed. She was not a prop. She was here to work, and she was working, and the implication that her appearance needed investment from his resources was... She stopped herself. She thought about it practically, the way she always had to think about things. If client events were part of the job, appropriate dress was part of the job. The card was not an insult, it was logistics. She pocketed the note and told herself she felt nothing. Her pulse said otherwise. The event was 2 weeks later, a dinner at a private room in a restaurant called Venezia, all dark wood and candlelight, and wine that came in bottles without price tags, the kind of place that was on no public list and required a name at a gate. She'd been to one of these before, once, for a surgical program fundraiser, and had spent most of the evening quietly aware that everyone there had more money than she would earn in 10 years. This was different. This room had weight in it. Not just wealth, weight. The specific heaviness of people who moved things that other people didn't know were moving. Luca had picked her up from the building lobby. He had a car. Of course he had a car. A black thing with a driver who had the build of someone whose job description included other duties. And he'd looked at her when she climbed in, without saying anything about how she looked, which was both a relief and, infuriatingly, a small disappointment. She'd worn a deep green dress that hit below the knee, with a neckline that was professional enough not to be read as something else, and elegant enough not to embarrass either of them. Gloria had helped her find it, with the particular efficiency of a woman who understood the assignment completely without having to be briefed on it. In the car, Luca had handed her a single sheet of paper. Names, relationships, things that don't need to be said aloud. She read it on the 5-minute drive, memorized what she could. The dinner was 12 people. She was the only woman not partnered with one of the men at the table, and she felt the recalibration of everyone's assessment when Luca introduced her as his associate rather than his assistant, which she noted and did not comment on. She sat to his right. She ate and spoke when spoken to, and listened to everything she wasn't supposed to be listening to, and when a man across the table named Carmine Esposito, older, silver-haired, eyes like something behind glass, leaned toward her and asked what her role at Ricci Holdings was, she said with absolute composure, "Whatever he needs." Esposito smiled slowly and looked at Luca. Luca looked at his wine glass. On the way back to her car, she'd arranged to pick it up later, he said in the dark interior of the car, "You handled yourself well." She looked out the window. "You sound surprised." "Not surprised, confirmed." She turned to look at him. In the passing light of street lamps, he was all shadow and geometry, the same controlled stillness she'd catalogued all week. She was aware of the proximity in a way that was purely physical, and therefore, she told herself, irrelevant. "What did you need confirmed?" she asked. He looked at her then, fully for the first time all evening, with the street light moving across his face like a slow tide. "That you don't become someone else under pressure," he said. She held his gaze for 3 seconds exactly, and then looked back at the window. She didn't say, "Neither do you." She thought it. 3 weeks in, and she had learned the language of him. Not words, he was spare with those, deployed them like a man who understood they had finite weight and were not to be wasted. What she'd learned was the grammar beneath the words, the slight forward lean when something interested him, the stillness of his hands when he was thinking versus the single pen tap when he'd decided. The particular quality of his silence when he disapproved of something. Not cold exactly, but pressurized, like air before a storm. She'd also learned, incidentally, that the man was working at a pace that should have required 3 people, and the fact that he'd gotten by with a rotating series of assistants who couldn't manage the environment explained a great deal about the state she'd walked into. She said this to him on a Thursday morning when she slid a revised organizational chart onto his desk, not of his company, but of the administrative function he was running, along with a list of what she identified as 6 redundancies. He looked at it. "You've been here 3 weeks." "Yes." "And you've restructured my administrative function." "I've proposed a restructuring. You haven't agreed to anything yet." He looked up. You're very comfortable telling me what I'm doing wrong. I'm comfortable telling you what could be more efficient. Whether that's wrong is your call. A long pause. He looked at the chart again. Where did you learn to see organizations this way? Managing a household on one income while someone else is spending it teaches you about resource allocation, she said, and there was no bitterness in it because she'd long since converted the experience into something more useful than a wound. He was quiet for a moment. My mother did the same thing, he said, and then he looked back at the chart, and she understood the conversation was over, which was fine, because in that single sentence he'd given her more about himself than in 3 weeks of working together, and she was smart enough to know not to pull on the thread directly. I'll think about it, he said, meaning the chart. That means yes, she told Gloria later, in the small kitchen adjacent to the reception area, where she made tea and Gloria made the industrial-grade coffee that seemed to constitute her primary food group. Gloria looked at her over the rim of her cup. He told you it means yes. No, he told me he'd think about it. That means yes. Gloria considered this. You've been here 3 weeks, and you speak fluent Luca. I speak fluent controlled man with too much to manage. It's a dialect I recognize. Gloria made a sound that was probably a laugh in whatever language Gloria expressed amusement. It was the beginning of something that would become, in the months ahead, the closest thing Mara had to an ally inside Ricci Holdings. The first time she saw him actually angry was on a Friday afternoon, 3.5 weeks in. She was at her desk, finishing the minutes from a board meeting, when the door to the office opened and a man she didn't recognize walked in, with the confidence of someone who had made the calculation that this was allowed. He was in his late 40s, well-dressed in a way that said he was trying to look like Luca and had gotten 3/4 of the way there. He had pale eyes and an expression she associated with men who had decided their appetites were justifications. He looked at her desk and looked at her and stopped. "Who are you?" he said. "Mara Vasquez, Mr. Ricci's assistant." She kept her tone level and her hands on the keyboard. "Can I help you?" "Is Luca in?" "Mr. Ricci is on a call. Do you have an appointment, Mr. Ferrante?" "I don't need an appointment." She looked at the schedule. His name was not on it. "I can let him know you're here, but he'll be another 20 minutes. Ferrante moved toward the inner office door. She was out of her chair before she'd consciously decided to be. "Mr. Ferrante." Her voice was the one she used in trauma situations, the one that cut through noise without raising itself. He stopped. "Mr. Ricci is on a call. You're welcome to wait, or I can book you an appointment for— Do you know who I am?" She met his eyes. "I know you're not on the schedule." For a moment it was perfectly balanced. He was a large man with the specific confidence of someone accustomed to having women step out of his way, and she was a small woman in a blazer standing between him and a closed door. And then the door opened. Luca filled the frame. He took in the tableau in approximately 1 second. His eyes moved to Ferrante with a quality she would only later find a word for. It wasn't fury. It was the thing on the other side of fury, where the temperature drops rather than rises, where the emotion has been so thoroughly compressed it has become a different substance entirely. "Ferrante," he said. "Luca." Ferrante's confidence recalibrated visibly downward. I needed to talk about the... You'll make an appointment. His voice was absolutely even. Through Miss Vasquez. Ferrante's pale eyes moved to her. Something moved in them, not respect, but the recognition of a line he hadn't known was there. Of course, he said, with a smile that wasn't one. He left. The door closed behind him, and she turned to find Luca still standing in the doorway of his office, looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize, something between assessment and something else she didn't have a name for yet. You stood up, he said. He was going into your office without an appointment. He outranks half the people in this building. He didn't have an appointment. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in. She came in. He sat at his desk. She stood. Nico Ferrante has known my family for 20 years, he said. He is not someone people casually obstruct. I wasn't casual about it, she said. And I wasn't obstructing. I was doing my job. He will make your life uncomfortable if he decides to. I imagine a lot of people in your circle make each other's lives uncomfortable when the mood takes them. She met his eyes. I still did the right thing. You were on a call. He didn't have an appointment. If the structure of access to you doesn't matter when someone decides it doesn't matter at all. He leaned back slowly in his chair. She had the sudden awareness of her own heart rate. You're right, he said. She blinked. He noticed. You expected an argument, he said. I expected... She stopped, recalibrated. I expected you to tell me there were hierarchies I didn't understand yet. There are, he said, but in this room I decide them, and you're right. He turned back to his desk, which was the dismissal. Close the door on your way out. She did. She stood on the other side of it for one brief second and pressed her hand flat against the wood and breathed. Then she went back to her desk and finished the board minutes and told herself she felt nothing. Her hands were very slightly unsteady for the next hour. She worked through it. May moved into June, and the city unfurled itself in that particular Chicago way, the lake air turning from knife-cold to something that carried warmth in the late afternoon, the streets filling up, the light staying longer. Mara noticed these things from the 42nd floor window in the minutes between tasks, which was all the noticing she allowed herself. She was good at her job. She had known she would be, but the specific shape of her competence was still clarifying, the way water finds its shape in a new container. She managed Luca's calendar with the precision of an OR schedule, accounting for hard stops and buffer time and the specific human truth that no meeting of his ever ran short because everyone in a room with him wanted to stay there as long as they were allowed to. She learned the rhythms of the organization below her, who answered quickly and who required follow-up, which of the foundation's donors needed personal attention and which were satisfied with newsletters, how to reach Dante by text when Luca needed him and Dante was being deliberately unreachable. She also learned what happened in the building after 7 p.m. She wasn't supposed to know. She was supposed to have left by then, by the unspoken understanding that her hours were 7 to 6, and after that, the other work began and the other people arrived. But the structural inefficiency she'd identified in week 3 had created a backlog that took her 2 weeks to address, and she was regularly at her desk past 7, and she was not, by nature, someone who pretended not to notice things. Men she hadn't met through the official channels, conversations that stopped when she appeared in the kitchen for water, the elevator that required a key after 7, which Luca had given her without comment, The lower floors, she understood, were entirely legitimate. The real estate operation, the foundation offices, the hospitality management arm. The 44th and 45th floors were where the other work happened, and the 42nd floor was a kind of demilitarized zone, belonging to both worlds at once. She processed what she understood and what she didn't, and filed it without drama. She wasn't naive. She'd grown up in the neighborhood. She'd known since childhood that certain names meant certain things. But she was also practical enough to understand that her job was to do her job, and that whatever operated above and below the line of her knowledge was not her responsibility unless it directly affected what she was being asked to manage. What she couldn't process as easily was the growing awareness that Luca was watching her. Not in any way that could be objected to, not in any way she could have pointed to and said, "This." It was smaller than that. The quality of attention he gave to a room that included her versus a room that didn't. The way conversation she had with others on the floor seemed to reach him through some channel she couldn't identify. The way he occasionally asked, offhandedly, about something she'd said to Gloria or to one of the foundation staff, questions phrased as idle rather than deliberate, as if he'd overheard rather than been informed. She brought it up with Gloria on a Wednesday, with the blunt pragmatism that was becoming the register of their friendship. "He tracks what I'm doing," she said, keeping her voice low, even in the empty kitchen. "Not in a way that interferes, just he knows things he shouldn't know from simply being in the same room." Gloria wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and said nothing for a moment. "He does that with everyone," she said, finally. "It doesn't feel like everyone." Gloria looked at her with a directness that was its own kind of communication. "No," she said. "I suppose it doesn't." "What does that mean?" "It means I've worked here for 9 years," Gloria said, "and in that time I've seen him watch you differently than he watches other people. And I am not going to say more than that, because I value my position and possibly my life." Mara opened her mouth. "No," Gloria said pleasantly, "I'm done talking about this." The watching crystallized one afternoon in June when she was in the conference room working through a grant application for the Ricci Foundation's literacy program. It was detailed work. She'd been at it for 2 hours and was at the stage where her concentration had acquired the specific texture of deep focus, the kind where she wasn't aware of time or the room around her. She looked up at some point, and Luca was in the doorway. He wasn't trying to get her attention. He wasn't crossing to the table or reaching for something or en route to somewhere else in the room. He was simply in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms loosely crossed, and he was looking at her. She held his gaze. "How long have you been there?" she asked. "A few minutes." She kept her voice even. "Did you need something?" Something shifted in his expression, something she was starting to recognize, the slight movement of a control being exercised, a thing being chosen against rather than yielded to. "I wanted to see the application when you're done," he said. "I'll leave it on your desk." He didn't move for another second. Then, "Take a break, Mara. You've been in here since 2. It was the first time he had used her name without the miss. She felt it in the base of her spine. "I'm fine," she said, and was proud of how normal it sounded. He nodded once, pushed off the doorframe, and left. She sat very still for a moment, and then returned to the application and wrote 3 paragraphs that were probably the best she'd produced all afternoon, which she attributed to spite, and not to anything else. She had dinner with her father that Sunday. He was doing better. She could see it in the colour in his face, in the way the tremor in his hands had settled. The knowledge that the debt was being addressed, however slowly, had taken something off him that she hadn't fully understood was there until it was gone. He asked about the job without asking about the specifics, in the way of a man who knew enough to understand that certain things were better left in the gaps. "He's fair," she said, which was true. "He's demanding." "Is he?" Her father stopped, started again. "Does he treat you respectfully?" She thought about the doorway, the first name, the instruction to take a break delivered as a command and received as something else entirely. "Yes," she said, "he does." Her father looked at his hands. "Mara, what I put you in—" "Don't," she said gently. "I need to say it." "I know. And you've said it. And I forgive you. And now we need to move forward." She reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. "This is manageable. I'm managing it." He looked at her with eyes that had her mother's shape and his own particular sorrow. "You've always managed everything," he said, "since you were 19. You've always been the one holding things together." "Someone had to be," she said, and smiled so he wouldn't see the cost of it. On the drive back, the city sliding past her windows in the blue evening, she let herself feel, briefly and precisely, the accumulated weight of being the one who holds things together. Not grief, not resentment, just the weight itself, acknowledged, felt, and then returned to the place where she kept things she couldn't afford to let slow her down. She thought about a doorway and a man in it, and the first time he had called her by her name. Then she turned on the radio and drove home. June brought a crisis. She'd been there 8 weeks when it happened. A Thursday, the afternoon beginning normally, Luca on back-to-back calls, herself working through the quarterly foundation reports, the city outside in full-blown summer brilliance and apparently unaware that the world was capable of violence. The call came in at 2:15. She took it on the main line because Gloria had stepped out. The voice on the other end was a man she'd learned to recognize, Sal, one of Luca's senior people, the one who never called the main line. He said 4 words. She processed them. She was at Luca's door in 10 seconds. She knocked, the one exception she'd made to Gloria's rule, learned through experience, which was that emergencies were different. He looked up. She said, "Sal, main line. He says it's Dante." Luca's face didn't change, but he was at the phone in 3 strides, and she was already backing out of the room. What she gathered in the next hour, from fragments of phone calls, from people arriving at the office, from the specific quality of the energy that compressed the floor, was that Dante had been in an incident. A meeting in the South Side, something about territory and someone who hadn't understood the map. He was at Northwestern Memorial. He was alive. The qualification of alive was itself information about the severity. She didn't ask questions. She cleared Luca's afternoon calendar and made 2 calls on her own authority to reschedule things that would create problems if they weren't rescheduled. And then she made coffee, because the number of people moving through the office required it, and she sat at her desk and was available and efficient and unobtrusive, which was what the moment needed. Luca was in the conference room with 4 men she'd never met, the door closed, the conversation inaudible. She watched him through the glass wall, not obviously, not in a way anyone would clock, and she saw what she'd never seen before. The control fractured. Not broken, fractured. A single fault line in the otherwise perfect architecture of his composure. His brother. She filed it. She filed the fact that Luca Ricci, who she had seen manage a room of power brokers without a single unnecessary movement, could be fractured by fear for one specific person. At 4:30 he came out. The men filed past her desk and left. He stood in the middle of the office with his jacket off and his hands in his pockets, and she saw him decide something in real time. The moment of recalibration, the walls returning to their positions. He looked at her. "The Brennan meeting tomorrow morning," he said, "rescheduled to next Thursday. The Holt Foundation call is moved to 8 a.m. Monday. Everything else stayed as is." She paused. "Your car is downstairs." He looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't ask you to reschedule anything." "No," she agreed. "You did it on your own judgment." "Yes." The quiet between them was different from its usual quality. It was the quiet of a man deciding whether to be angry and finding, against expectation, that he wasn't. "Is there anything else I should know about?" he asked. "Carmine Esposito's office called twice. I told them you were unavailable and would return the call tomorrow. I didn't say why." He nodded. He picked up his jacket. He started for the door and then stopped. "Thank you," he said. She waited until she heard the elevator close, then she sat down and let her hands shake for exactly 30 seconds before she made them stop. Dante was in the hospital for 4 days. She knew this because Luca was in the office every one of those days, working with the specific ferocity of a man doing it to keep himself from doing something else. And she worked alongside him at her own pace and said nothing about the dark circles under his eyes or the fact that on the second day he didn't eat lunch. On the third day, she put a container of food on the corner of his desk at 1 p.m., soup from the place on the ground floor that Gloria had told her was where he ordered when he was ordering for himself. He stared at it. "You didn't eat yesterday," she said, without looking up from her screen. "I'm aware of my own habits." "I'm sure. I also noticed they were going to create a problem, so I addressed the problem." She looked up. "The same logic you apply to everything else." He looked at her. She looked back. He picked up the soup. They said nothing else about it. On the fourth day, Dante came to the office, arm in a sling, a bruise along his jaw in the yellow-green of healing, wearing a shirt left open at the collar and looking, despite everything, entirely himself. He stopped at her desk and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts warmth and something more complex. "I hear you kept this place together while my brother was losing his mind," he said. "I did my job," she said. Dante smiled slowly. "Yeah," he said. "That's not what Gloria said." Gloria has a gift for narrative embellishment. Gloria is relentlessly factual, and we both know it. He sat on the edge of her desk, which she didn't protest, because he was convalescing, and it seemed unkind. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Why are you really here?" She looked at him steadily. "I'm working off my father's debt." "Yeah, I know the official version." He tilted his head, and there was intelligence in his face beneath all the warmth. She'd known it was there. She'd seen it in how Luca spoke to him when there weren't other people present, the two of them speaking in the shorthand of genuine mutual respect. "I mean, why are you still here? Because most people, they see what this place is. They make their exit. You don't strike me as someone who stays somewhere out of obligation alone." She thought about the answer. She gave him the honest one, because she'd decided early that Dante was someone who could handle honesty. "I'm good at this, and I don't leave things unfinished." He looked at her for a moment longer, then he glanced toward the closed office door. "He's different since you came," he said quietly, in a register that wasn't the usual banter. "I don't know what that means." "I think you do." He pushed off her desk. "I think you're just being careful." He headed for Luca's door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Mara, he doesn't thank people. Pretty much ever. So when he does," he looked at her, "take note." He went in. She sat with that for a long time. She was taking note. She had been taking notes from the beginning. She was terrified of what the notes were starting to say. In July, he took her to the house. Not the penthouse, that would come later. The house, which was in Lake Forest, 40 minutes north of the city, a property that appeared in the real estate holdings as a residential asset, but functioned, she understood quickly, as the centre of gravity for the family. The place where the business that couldn't be done in offices got done, and also where Luca kept the parts of himself that didn't belong in the office. She went because he asked, which was itself unusual, the asking rather than the telling. He said, "There's a situation at the house that requires your organizational skills and your discretion, both of which I trust." And then he'd looked at her with the combination of gravity and something approaching courtesy that she'd come to understand was his version of warmth, and she'd said yes before she'd fully thought it through. The house was a revelation. She'd been building a picture of Luca Ricci from the fragments available to her, the controlled office, the careful speech, the brief, unguarded moments. She'd had the skeleton of him. The house gave her the rest. It was large and old and seriously beautiful. Lake Michigan visible from every room on the east side. The architecture something between a manor and a fortress. Interior design that suggested the work of someone who genuinely loved art and was not performing the love for anyone else. Books everywhere, shelved with the comfortable disorder of things that were read rather than displayed. A kitchen that had been used, not a kitchen as statement, but a kitchen with worn places on the counter where elbows had rested over many years. A photograph on the hallway wall. 2 boys and a woman with dark eyes, and an expression Mara recognized as the expression of a woman holding everything together. The situation that required her was, in practical terms, a records crisis. The house had served as a secondary administrative base before the offices consolidated in the city, and there were 15 years of physical and digital records in a state that required organization, cross-referencing, and a significant amount of judgment about what needed to be retained and what was now redundant. She spent the first day in the study, alone mostly, working through it systematically. Luca moved in and out of the house with the flow of his own agenda. Meetings, calls, at one point what sounded like a prolonged and highly contained argument in Italian with someone in the back room that she chose, professionally, not to have heard. At 6 o'clock he found her in the kitchen making coffee, because she'd been in the study for 7 hours and her back had staged a small rebellion. He stood in the doorway in a way that was becoming familiar, the lean, the arms loosely crossed, the attentiveness that he didn't try to conceal anymore, or hadn't been trying to conceal for the past few weeks. "You're staying for dinner," he said, not a question exactly. "I hadn't planned to." "It's a 2-hour drive at this time on a Friday." "I know how far it is." "Then you'll stay for dinner." He pushed off the doorframe and moved to the refrigerator with the ease of a man in his own space. "Sit down." "Are you cooking?" The surprise came out before she could modulate it. He glanced at her over his shoulder. The corner of his mouth moved. "You find that difficult to believe?" "I find it." She sat because her back was grateful for it. "I find it data I didn't have before." He made pasta. She watched him do it. The actual process, the ease of long practice, the particular quality of his attention when the focus was on something benign rather than dangerous. He cooked in his shirt sleeves, which he'd been determined to find unremarkable, and was finding the opposite of unremarkable. "Where did you learn?" she asked. "My mother." He didn't look up from the pot. She thought a man who couldn't cook was only half a man. "She sounds like someone I'd like." He went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had something in it. "She died 6 years ago," he said. "I'm sorry." "She'd have liked you," he said. Very simply, as if the sentence had surprised him slightly on its way out. He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at the pasta. She sat with the words and didn't know what to do with them, so she did what she always did, which was to keep them for later and redirect. "The records," she said. "I found some things that don't match. You should know." He brought the food to the table, and they sat across from each other, and she told him about the discrepancies in the records, and he listened and asked the right questions, and they talked about the organization with the specific intimacy of two people who were genuinely good at the same kind of thing. And the sun dropped behind the tree line, and the lake turned from blue to purple to black, and neither of them mentioned leaving. After dinner, he poured 2 glasses of wine without asking. She accepted hers. They moved to the chairs by the windows. The lake outside was dark now, the Chicago skyline a distant glitter to the south. "Why do you do this?" she asked. She hadn't planned it. It arrived because the house was soft in the way the office never was, and she was tired in the way that loosened restraint. He looked at the wine glass. "Clarify the question." "The family business. You're educated, you speak 3 languages, you run legitimate companies that make serious money. You didn't have to—" "You're asking why I didn't choose a different life?" "Yes." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "When I was 12, my father was in a situation. Someone came for us. My mother was frightened. Dante was 8. He paused. "I decided that no one would ever be in a position to frighten my family again. Every decision I've made since then has been toward that goal." She let the silence hold the weight of it. "And has it worked?" "Mostly." He looked at her. "The means to the end have created their own complications." "That's one way to put it." "What would you call it?" She thought for a moment. "A cage built out of the material of a fortress," she said. He looked at her sharply. It was the most unsettled she'd ever seen him. "Yes," he said after a moment. "That's closer." They sat with the lake and the wine and the wreckage of that honesty, and she thought, "I need to be very careful." And she thought, "I am already failing at being careful." And she looked at his profile against the dark window and understood, with the clarity of something that's been building for weeks and will no longer be managed, that she was in considerable trouble. He drove her back to the city at 10. They said very little in the car. The silence was the particular kind that has too much in it to be filled. When she got out at her building, he said, "Monday." "Monday," she agreed. She watched the car pull away and stood in the warm July night and pressed her hand against her sternum and counted until her pulse was reasonable. It took a while. His name was Adrian Wolfe, and he arrived in August. Adrian worked for one of Luca's legitimate business partners, an investment firm that handled a portfolio the Ricci Foundation used for its endowment, which meant he had regular, legitimate access to the office and specifically to the administrative layer where Mara functioned. He was charming in a way that was not threatening, which was itself refreshing. Mara's immediate social circle inside Ricci Holdings tended toward men whose charm was a kind of combat, whose attention was an assertion of dominance. Adrian was different. He was tall and sandy-haired and had a manner of speaking that was warm without being a performance. And on his third visit to the floor in 2 weeks, he stopped at her desk and said, "I've been trying to think of a reason to ask you to lunch for 3 visits now, and I've decided to stop looking for the reason and just ask." She blinked, recalibrated. "That's," she said, "actually pretty direct." "I'm a direct person," he smiled. "It's a Tuesday, it's noon, the place on the ground floor does an excellent grilled salmon." She thought about it for approximately 5 seconds. She was allowed to have lunch. She was a person. She was not, she reminded herself with some force, in any relationship that constituted a reason to decline. "Okay," she said. They had lunch. He was good company, intelligent, curious, not name-dropping, not performing. He asked about her work without asking about the parts he wasn't supposed to ask about, which suggested both intelligence and respect. She found herself relaxing in the way you relax with people who are uncomplicated, who don't require the constant vigilance that characterized most of her professional environment. She came back to the office at 1:15. Luca was at his desk. He knew she'd been to lunch. Of course he knew. He knew everything that happened on this floor. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The quality of his stillness when she passed through the office to her desk was different from usual, a degree or two tighter, like something that had been compressed further. She sat at her desk. She worked. She told herself she wasn't aware of the quality of his silence. She was entirely aware of it. Adrian asked her to dinner the following week. She was at her desk. He'd stopped by on the floor for a document review, and he asked with the same directness he'd deployed the first time, which she appreciated on principle, even as she registered, couldn't help registering, the way the air in the room had changed. She said, "Let me think about it." He said he'd call her. After he left, she went to the kitchen for water. Luca appeared at the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later. She wasn't sure if it was coincidence and decided it probably wasn't. "Wolf?" he said. She turned. "He's asked me to dinner." "I'm aware." "Are you?" She kept her voice neutral. "Is there a problem with that?" He leaned against the doorframe. The kitchen was small, and he occupied more of the available space than the square footage should have allowed. His expression was the controlled one, but the control was doing more work than usual. She could see it, in the tighter set of his jaw, in the particular stillness that in another person would have been tension poorly managed. "Wolf works with people I trust less than him," he said, which is already a limited category. "He works for an investment firm that manages your foundation's endowment," she said. "You vetted him." Vetting someone professionally and trusting them with... He stopped. She waited. He looked at her with something she recognized this time, with the specific discomfort of a woman who had been trying not to recognize it for weeks. "With your personal information," he said. And they both understood it wasn't what he'd almost said. Luca. His name, used directly, without the professional buffer of Mr. Ricci. She watched his face do something she'd never seen it do, a fractional loosening, as if the name in her voice had reached something. "My personal life is not part of the job. I know." He looked at her steadily. "Go to dinner if you want to." She said, "That sounds like something someone says when they don't want the person to go to dinner." "I said you could." "You said I could." She took a breath. "Luca, are you—" She stopped herself. What she had been about to ask was not professional. What she had been about to ask was the question she'd been not asking for weeks. "Are you concerned about my discretion? In the context of someone connected to the foundation?" He held her gaze. "Among other things." The "among other things" fell into the room and didn't leave. She said, "I'll be discreet." He said nothing. He left the kitchen. She stood for a moment, looking at the space he'd occupied, and felt, running through the entire interaction, the particular electric undercurrent of a thing that was being handled rather than resolved. She went to dinner with Adrian. It was a pleasant evening. He was warm and funny and interested in her, genuinely interested, in the way of a man who hadn't decided what she was before she'd had a chance to show him. They talked about things that had nothing to do with Ricci Holdings, which was itself almost intoxicatingly ordinary. She ate good food and drank good wine and came home feeling uncomplicated, light. The kind of light you feel when you've briefly put down something very heavy. She sat on her couch afterward and felt, settling back into her like water finding its level, the weight she'd briefly put down. It had a specific shape and a specific name, and she was tired of pretending it didn't. Monday morning, Luca was at his desk before her for the first time in 6 weeks. He'd beaten her in. He was on the phone when she came in, and he looked up when she passed, and there was something different in his face, worked over somehow, the way things look when they've been considered at length in the dark. He finished the call. He looked at her desk rather than at her. "The Henderson meeting is moved to 8:30, he said. "I'll adjust." She sat. She began to work. At 10, he said, "Did you enjoy your evening?" She kept her eyes on her screen. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. "Yes," she said. He said nothing else. She filed the nothing and the something and the space between them and told herself she was going to be sensible about this. She was going to be practical and professional and not make any decisions based on the fact that Luca Ricci's version of jealousy was the most restrained and therefore most devastating thing she had ever been in the room with. She was not sensible about it. She was not, it turned out, that good at being sensible about this particular thing. But she held the line for now. September arrived with a shift in the world's temperature that felt to Mara less meteorological than metaphorical. She had been at Ricci Holdings for 5 months. The debt had been reduced to something she could do the math on. Luca had been consistent in his valuation, and her performance reviews, delivered in the minimal manner of a man who wasn't practiced in praise but was rigorous about accuracy, had consistently placed her work above the initial agreed rate. She had not asked for more. He had given it anyway. She had also, in 5 months, become something she hadn't planned to become: indispensable. Not merely useful, indispensable. The specific, alarming variety that meant when she had 2 days off for what was supposed to be a routine procedure, she hadn't told him what it was, had only submitted the personal day requests, she came back to an office in a controlled variety of disarray that told her exactly how much of the functioning had been in her hands. She spent the first day back restoring order, and the second afternoon being informed by Dante, who had stopped by the office with the frequency of someone who was primarily visiting her desk rather than his brother, that Luca had been absolutely impossible, but in the quiet way, which is worse. He was fine, she said. Mara. He reorganized the filing cabinet himself, in the middle of a Thursday. The filing cabinet you reorganized your first week. Dante tilted his head. He put things back the way you had them. She kept her face professional. Inside her chest, something moved like the first warmth after a long cold. He needed the Brennan contracts, she said, which were in the cabinet. He didn't need the Brennan contracts. He needed you to come back. He held up a hand before she could respond. I'm not saying it to make you uncomfortable. I'm saying it because I think it's important information, and someone should say it. She said, he could get another assistant. Dante looked at her with the particular affection of a man who finds other people's self-deception both tender and exasperating. Yes, he said, he could. He won't. The threat came from nowhere, the way they always did. She was leaving the building at 6:30 on a Thursday, the September air already autumn-edged and cool, her mind on the grocery list she needed to address before the stores closed. She had her keys in her hand and was 3 steps from the building entrance when a car that had been idling along the opposite curb pulled even with her and stopped. The window came down. Mara Vasquez? She stopped. She turned. She didn't run because running was what people did in movies, and in real life it accomplished nothing except telling someone you knew you were in danger. She stood and looked at the man in the back seat of the car and did not recognize him, but recognized the type. Middle 50s, not fat but densely built, the expensive suit that didn't quite hide the fact that it was armor. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was level. "A friend of your employer's," the man said. He smiled. It was the smile of someone who found the word friend amusing. "I wanted to introduce myself. Tell him I said hello." The window went up. The car pulled away. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed. Then she went back into the building, took the elevator to 42, and found Luca still at his desk. He looked up. Something in her expression reached him across the room in the time it took her to cross it, because he was already rising when she stopped in front of his desk. She told him, precisely, without drama, the way you relay critical information in a high-pressure environment. Car, window, man, description, words, gone. He listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened, and she watched his face do the controlled compression she'd seen only twice before, after the call about Dante and in the kitchen when she'd mentioned Adrian's invitation to dinner. He came around the desk. He stood close enough that she had to look up slightly, which she was accustomed to, but which had a different quality right now. "You're not hurt," he said. "No." "You came back up immediately?" "Yes." His eyes moved across her face in a way that was checking rather than looking. Inventory of damage, the same thing she did in the OR when she needed to confirm a status before proceeding. "Good," he said. Then he picked up his phone. She stood there while he made 2 calls in rapid succession, the second one in Italian, which she'd been slowly decoding over months, enough to understand that he was not conveying a greeting. His voice during these calls was quiet and without inflection, and absolutely, specifically terrifying. She thought, "I live and work adjacent to the edge of something I don't fully see, and I've been treating it as an abstraction, and it's not an abstraction." He ended the calls. He looked at her. "Stay here tonight," he said. She blinked. "Here?" "The building has a security suite. We use it when situations require it." He said situations the way most people said Tuesdays, practically, without drama. "One of my people will take you home in the morning when we have a better picture." She processed this. Who was he? Someone trying to send a message. To you? Through me? Yes. His jaw was tight, not with anger at her. She'd learned by now to read the directionality of his tension. "I didn't anticipate that you'd be visible enough to be—" He stopped. "I should have anticipated it sooner." "Luca?" She said it, and he looked at her, and she held his gaze. "I'm not fragile." "I'm aware." The 2 words were clipped, impatient, not with her, but with himself. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't entirely decode. Something compounded, multiple things stratified. "It's a mistake I made," he said, "that won't be repeated." She wanted to ask which mistake, the one where he'd underestimated the exposure, or the one where he'd allowed someone who worked for him to matter enough that threatening her was useful as a message. She didn't ask. The security suite was a small apartment on the 39th floor, not glamorous but comfortable, with a city view and everything needed for an unexpected overnight. She lay on the unfamiliar bed with the city light coming in through the curtains and thought about a man 3 floors above her who had looked at her face when she came back into the building and done the math faster than she could finish reporting. She thought about the word matter and everything it contained. She slept badly and was back at her desk by 7. He was already there. He looked at her when she came in. He said nothing about the night, nothing about the morning, nothing about anything beyond, "The Henderson Quarterly is on your desk." "I'll start on it," she said. They worked. The morning moved. At 11, he put a coffee on the corner of her desk. He had made it himself, from the kitchen, not the building cafe service, and she looked at it, and then at him, and he had already turned back to his desk. She drank the coffee and said nothing. Some things didn't need words to be understood. October. The leaves turned and the lake went grey, and the city put on its autumn armour, and Mara Vasquez had been inside Luca Ricci's orbit for 6 months, and the debt stood at $104,000, and she had stopped doing the calculation of how many weeks remained, because something else had overtaken it. He moved to the penthouse in October. The building, not the office building, a residential tower on the Gold Coast that looked like someone had taken the idea of luxury and decided to be entirely literal about it, had been in the portfolio for 3 years, used primarily for client entertainment and as overflow accommodation for the family's various operations. He told her this with the same neutrality he used for everything that wasn't emotionally relevant, which increasingly felt like the most important category of information about him. What prompted the move, she gathered from contextual fragments, from Dante's less guarded comments, from Gloria's careful non-statements, was the incident in September. The man in the car, the message sent through her, the calculation Luca had made afterward about exposure and security and where he needed to be. He needed to be somewhere defensible. She was at the penthouse for the first time because of the organizational requirement. The move from the house to the tower created an administrative migration that required her specific knowledge of both the office and the personal record systems. Gloria came the first day. Then the second day, it was just her and Luca and the vast space of the penthouse spreading itself out around them. It was 3,000 square feet on the 48th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. Lake Michigan to the east, the skyline in every other direction, the city laid below, like an empire that had decided to celebrate itself with light. The interior was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said what she'd expected instead. Warmer than the office. The same absence of excess, the same quality of things selected rather than accumulated. But the warmth of the Lake Forest house transplanted into something more severe. Books, photographs, the same ones from the house, she noticed, moved here. A kitchen that was already being used. She worked through the records migration at the desk he'd set up for her in the study, off the main living space, and she was aware with every hour that the space around her was more him, more personal, more unguarded than anything she'd had access to before. At 6, he appeared in the doorway of the study. "I'm making dinner," he said. She looked up. "I'll finish this first." "I said I'm making dinner." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to love, the one he used when he was giving her an instruction and had decided not to perform it as a command, the slight adjustment that said he'd considered how to say it and chosen the softer route. 20 minutes. She closed the laptop. The kitchen was at the western end of the penthouse, and the last of the October light was coming through the windows, and he was at the stove, and she sat on a stool at the island and watched him cook, with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, no wasted motion, no performance. "You do this every time you're working here?" she asked. "Cook? Most nights." He adjusted the heat on something. "It's useful to have one thing that's straightforward." "Is most of your life not straightforward?" "Almost none of it." He said it without self-pity, as a fact of geography. She watched him for a moment. "The debt is at 104,000, she said. He didn't turn around. "I know. My estimate at the current rate is 17 more months." "I know." She paused. "Is that a problem?" Now he turned. He looked at her across the kitchen island with an expression she was becoming fluent in, the multi-layered one, the one that had several things stacked behind the controlled surface. "No," he said. "Because when it's paid, Mara." He said her name with the weight he always gave it, precise, intentional. "We'll discuss that when we're there." She held his gaze. "I need to know I'm not in an indefinite situation." "You're not." He turned back to the stove. "I keep my agreements." "That's not quite what I was asking." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said, and it meant something different than the last time he'd said it, and they both knew that, and neither of them acknowledged it directly, and the October light moved across the kitchen floor, and the city glittered in the windows, and the food on the stove made the kitchen smell warm and specific. After dinner, he poured wine. They stood at the eastern windows. The lake was a dark mirror 48 floors below, the city breathing around it. "Tell me something I don't know about you," she said. The wine had done something small to her caution. He considered it seriously, which was how he took everything she said. "I was a pianist," he said. "Until I was 17. She looked at him. "Were you good?" "Conservatory level." He looked at the lake. "My mother wanted it for me. After she died..." A pause. I stopped. "You could start again." "Some things don't restart." He looked at her sideways briefly. "What don't I know about you?" She thought. "I'm terrified of ordinary," she said. "Not of dangerous or hard, of ordinary. I think I chose a hospital career partly because it was never boring." She paused. "I think I might choose difficult things partly for the same reason." She felt his eyes on her profile. "Is that why you're still here?" he asked quietly. She kept looking at the lake. "Maybe partly," she said. "Not entirely." The silence held everything they weren't saying. It held the shape of what was between them, all its weight and warmth, all the weeks of careful distance. He said nothing, but his hand, resting on the window ledge, moved half an inch toward hers and stopped. Half an inch, the smallest possible motion, the most expensive. She looked at it. She looked at the lake. She did not move her hand, not yet. But the not yet had a different quality than all the previous not yets. It had a date in it, even if neither of them could name the date yet. It had an ending. She drove home at 10. In the elevator going down, she pressed her hand flat against the wall and breathed. 48 floors below, the lobby, the city, the ordinary world. She stepped out into it and understood she was no longer quite the same person who had stepped off this elevator the first time. November arrived like something that had been decided. She arrived at the penthouse on a Tuesday morning to find a situation that had been in progress for hours. She could read it in the people, in the energy, in Luca's particular quality of control, which had been compressed to a diamond-hard point. Someone had moved against a member of the Ricci family's extended circle. A threat not yet acted upon. She gathered this from the edges of conversations that stopped when she came into rooms, but credible enough that the family's security apparatus had been operating through the night. Dante was there, uncharacteristically uncharming, quiet and focused. A man she knew only as Sal, who was Luca's operational second-in-command, moved through the space with the specific efficiency of a person who had run this kind of morning before. She went to work. There was legitimate work to do. The penthouse office function had been expanding. She was managing more from here now than from the building. And she did it without asking what was happening, without performing distress, without making the situation about her presence. She made coffee for the room and brought it without announcement and returned to the study. At 11, Sal knocked on the study door. He was a man of about 50, ex-military in the way certain people carried it in their joints, who had treated her from the beginning with a particular respectful wariness. She was the boss's person. He wasn't sure what category that put her in, and she'd never felt the need to clarify it for him. "There are some people here who are going to ask you questions," he said. "You don't have to answer them." She looked up. "What people?" "Federal." She sat with this for a moment. "What kind of questions?" "They want to establish who has access to the penthouse." It's routine for a situation like this. Background. Who else are they talking to? Everyone on this floor. He looked at her with the steady look of a man communicating something carefully. You haven't seen or heard anything that would create a problem. You do administrative work. That's what you do. She met his eyes. That's what I do, she said. The federal agents were two of them, professional, courteous in the specific way of people trained to be professionally courteous. They asked about her role, her tenure, her scope of work. She answered clearly and completely, which she'd found was always the right approach with professional questioners, not elaborately, not with the excess that revealed anxiety, but accurately and without the kind of absence that revealed concealment. What she knew, she knew. What she didn't know, she said she didn't know. They thanked her. They left. She went back to work. 20 minutes later, Luca came to the study door. He looked at her for a moment. Sal told me, he said. I'm aware of what I do and don't know, she said. Yes. He came in and closed the door, which he almost never did when they were alone. He stood in the closed room with her, and she could see it on him. The full weight of the morning, the night before the morning, the accumulated cost of what it meant to live the way he lived. He looked, for one brief, unguarded moment, tired. Are you all right? She asked. He looked at her with the expression that was becoming its own language. I don't typically get asked that. I'm asking. He actually sat, in the chair across from the study desk, which was unusual enough that she registered it immediately. He put both hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked up, something had shifted. Not the control falling, the control choosing to step aside, briefly, deliberately. No one was hurt, he said. The situation is contained. We'll know more tonight. That's not what I asked. A pause. No, he said. I'm not all right. I haven't slept. The situation required. He stopped, started again. There were choices made last night that I'm not. Another stop. I do what I do because the alternative is worse. I have believed that since I was 12 years old. Some days I believe it more than others. She didn't move. She understood that what was happening in this room required stillness. The kind of stillness she used in trauma situations, when someone was saying the important thing, an interruption would cause the door to close. Some days, he said, I look at what I've built and I see the fortress. And then I see what's inside it. And I wonder which part I built to protect and which part I built to lock away. The room was very quiet. What's inside it? She asked, gently. He looked at her. The look was the longest and the most direct one he'd given her. All the careful management absent, all the layers peeled back to the thing underneath, the thing she'd been catching glimpses of for months. Less than there should be, he said, and recently more. She understood. She held it. She didn't move toward it or away from it. She let it exist between them, real and acknowledged, the first thing in months that had been both. Luca, she said. Don't, he said. Not harshly, quietly. The quiet of a man who knows that if she finishes the sentence, something irrevocable will begin. Not now. Not today. She nodded. She understood the postponement. She understood that not now was not no, and that the difference mattered enormously. He rose. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Thank you, he said, for this morning. I did my job. You did more than your job. She looked at him. "Yeah," she said. "I know." He left the study. She sat and breathed and let herself for 30 full seconds feel everything she'd been managing. The weight of it, the warmth of it, the specific and extraordinary difficulty of being in love with a man who kept his most important things in a room he was still learning to open. 30 seconds. Then she went back to work. Dante knew. She became certain of this in the second week of November at a dinner at the house in Lake Forest, a family dinner which she'd been told to attend as an organisational presence, but which was, in reality, the Ricci family's way of meeting her in a context that wasn't the office. There were 8 people at the table, most of them family, cousins, an aunt, the family lawyer whose presence at a dinner table told you something about the kind of family you were dealing with. Dante was at the opposite end from Luca, which was its own statement about their dynamic, far enough to have their own centre of gravity, close enough to be a continuous undercurrent of fraternal communication. She sat beside Luca because that was where his assistant would sit. She wore the green dress again, the same one she'd worn to the Venezia dinner, because it had worked once and she was pragmatic about what worked. He held her chair without looking at her when she sat, which was both automatic and, she'd stopped calling these things automatic months ago, intentional. Across the table, Dante watched. He watched the way Luca poured her wine before his own. He watched the way Luca's posture shifted almost imperceptibly when someone at the far end of the table made a comment she couldn't hear, but that made her laugh. He watched, she was fairly certain, all the invisible architecture of 2 people who had not said the thing, and were, nonetheless, building the thing in every room they shared. After dinner, he fell into step with her as she moved toward the kitchen with her plate, because the Vasquez household had a custom, and she was a woman who'd never quite shaken it. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She set the plate by the sink, and he set his beside it. Old habit. He leaned against the counter. He looked at her with the warm intelligence that was Dante's particular gift, the ability to see clearly without making it feel like an examination. "Can I say something that's none of my business?" he asked. "You can try." He smiled briefly. "He's not going to tell you. He doesn't know how. He hasn't. It's not that he doesn't feel." He stopped, restarted with a directness that felt like a gift. He spent 20 years being the person who doesn't need things from other people. He built it that way deliberately, because needing things is a vulnerability, and for him, vulnerability has always had a price. She looked at the plates in the sink. "I know that. I know you know." He looked at her. "I'm not saying this so you'll wait for him. I'm saying it so that if you decide you're done waiting, you understand what you're walking away from, and so you understand that he doesn't." She looked at him. "He doesn't what?" "Understand that you might not wait," Dante said quietly. He's never had to account for the possibility of something he wanted simply not being there anymore. He doesn't have the architecture for that fear, which means he might be dangerously close to discovering it. She said nothing for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're good for him," Dante said simply, "and I'm his brother, and this is the only way I know to help without interfering." He looked at her with something that was entirely sincere. "Also because you've been treating this debt like it's the whole story, and it's not the whole story, and I think you know that." She looked at him for a long time. "It started as the whole story," she said. "Yes, and then you met my brother." He pushed off the counter, which is what tends to happen with the things you think are one thing and then they're not. He returned to the dining room. She stood in the kitchen and heard the conversation from the other room and processed, quietly and completely, the fact that Dante Ricci was entirely right. It had started as the debt. It had become something so much more complicated than the debt that the debt was now almost a footnote, and the footnote was what she went home to calculate in the dark. She went back to the table. Luca looked at her when she sat down, with the look that was its own sentence, brief, warm, contained. And she thought, 23 months I would have given anything for this to be simple, for it to be a job I finish and leave. She thought, I don't want to leave. She thought, that is the most inconvenient thing I have ever felt. Later, leaving, he walked her to her car. The November air had genuine cold in it now, the sky enormous and starless. He opened the car door in the particular way he did things, not performed gentleness, but precision, a care that looked like habit because it had become one. Drive carefully, he said. I always do. He stood with his hand on the car door for a half-second that felt like something being decided against. Then he closed the door and stepped back, and she drove away. And in the rear-view mirror she could see him standing on the gravel drive, watching until she was gone. She drove the 40 minutes to Chicago, thinking about the word always, and what you build when you stop letting yourself need things, and what you might build differently if you tried. December. The city converted to its festive winter, and the night came early, and the lake went iron grey, and the world contracted to candlelight and wool, and the specific warmth of enclosed spaces. The breaking came from an unexpected direction, because that was how it always went. She was at the building, the office building, the 42nd floor, on a Friday afternoon, and she had been going through the foundation's year-end financials when she found the discrepancy. Not the kind she'd found in the house records 9 weeks ago, administrative, the work of imprecision. This was different. This was the kind of discrepancy that had a purpose. She looked at it for a long time. She traced it back through 3 documents. It was small, 50,000 in a foundation sub-account, moved through 2 pass-through entities in a way that was technically within the letter of the foundation's organizational documents, but was clearly designed to obscure. Not to her. She hadn't been meant to see this particular document set. She'd found it because she had, over the course of 6 months, reorganized the entire administrative filing structure and therefore knew where things were that other people had expected to be buried. She sat with it for 20 minutes. She thought about what it meant and who had the access and the knowledge to construct it. Then she printed the relevant documents, went to Luca's office, and put them on his desk without a word. He looked at them. He looked at her. He read them. When he looked up, his expression was the controlled one. But she'd been in this office for 6 months, and she could see what was underneath it. Not anger. Something colder and more specific than anger. Recognition. Where did you find these? He said. She told him. She told him precisely. The document path, the filing location, the cross-reference that had revealed the pass-through structure. She gave him everything. He listened without interrupting. He looked at the documents again. He set them down with the controlled care of a man managing his own hands. This stays in this room, he said. Of course. He looked at her. You understand what this means. Someone with access to the Foundation's secondary account structure has been moving money through it in a way that's technically permissible but practically deceptive. She held his gaze. Someone inside. Yes. She waited. Thank you, he said. The words had a weight that was different from his usual precision, something underneath them that was both gratitude and something she might have called relief. I didn't do anything except find it, she said. You found it because you were thorough, and you brought it to me rather than… He stopped. Rather than what? Rather than what someone who had been approached might have done with it, he said carefully. She went very still. You thought someone might try to approach me? His jaw tightened slightly. It's a consideration I'd run. You're close to information. You have a financial vulnerability. He met her eyes. I was wrong. You didn't think I was wrong, she said. You thought I might be susceptible. I considered the possibility, he said. I dismissed it. I'm telling you now because you want me to know you thought it and dismissed it. Because I want you to know I trust you, he said. The words came out with the slight quality of something that had been rehearsed against itself, of a man who doesn't say things like this easily and knows it and says them anyway. The office was very quiet. She picked up the papers from his desk. I'll make a secure copy and put the originals in your personal file, she said, which was the professional thing to say, which was the only thing she could manage in the face of I trust you, delivered by Luca Ricci in the tone of a confession. She was at the door when he said, Mara. She stopped. She turned. He was standing behind the desk, and the afternoon light was behind him, and he was looking at her with the full, unmanaged version of the expression that she'd been reading fragments of for 6 months. All of it present, nothing held back, the control set down. I don't want to be your employer, he said. The words fell into the room and stayed. She held very still. That is… He stopped. He looked away briefly, a thing she'd never seen him do, the sideways look of a man finding his footing with language on unfamiliar terrain. This started as a transaction. I know that. I want you to know that it isn't… He stopped again. What you are to me is not what I agreed to when your father walked into my office with a problem I should have refused to take. She said, What am I to you? He looked at her directly. I don't have a word for it that I've been able to bring myself to say. She breathed. She held the papers against her chest and looked at him and thought about Dante in the kitchen saying he doesn't know how, and understood that this halting, careful, unprecedented offering was Luca Ricci at the edge of knowing how. Then say it without the word, she said. He crossed the room, not fast, slow, deliberate, the way he did everything, but with an intentionality that was different from his usual control. He stopped close enough that she had to look up, and he reached out and took the papers from her hands and set them on the nearest surface without looking at them, and he looked at her. You came into this building to pay a debt, he said. You have paid more than that. He looked at her face, at each part of it, with the specific attention of a man cataloguing something he wants to keep. I don't want what's owed. I want what isn't. She breathed in. He was close enough that the breath was almost shared. Luca, she said, and her voice came out softer than she'd intended. I know, he said. I know what I am, what this is. I know I'm not— Stop, she said. She reached up and put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, the way she'd pressed her hand against the elevator wall all those months ago, grounding herself, testing for realness. She could feel his heart through the shirt. It was not as steady as everything else about him. He went very still. I know what you are, she said. I've known from the beginning. I chose to stay. A pause. I keep choosing. His hand came up and covered hers. Just that, covered it, held it there, over his heart. The room held them. The December light held them. Everything that had been building for 6 months held them in this first moment of its acknowledgement. He didn't kiss her. He held her hand against his chest and looked at her, and she looked back. And between them the whole complicated, specific, dangerous truth of what they were to each other settled into its shape. It was a beginning, an actual one, and it was the most frightening thing she had ever felt, and she had never been more certain of anything. The kiss came 3 days later. She'd been thinking about it, trying not to, managing mostly to redirect the thought, but it was there the way certain things are there, persistent, warm, occupying space in her awareness like a piece of furniture she kept walking around. It happened in the penthouse because that was where the important things had been happening since October. He'd asked her to come by on a Sunday, not a work request specifically. He'd said it on the phone on Saturday evening in the spare way he phrased things he wasn't entirely certain of. Come tomorrow, we'll have dinner. The come tomorrow was new. The we'll have dinner was an offering, not a scheduling item. She came. He was in the kitchen when she arrived, and the penthouse smelled of something Italian and slow-cooked, and the Sunday city was grey and cold outside the enormous windows, and she stood in the entry taking off her coat and felt, settling over her, the particular domesticity of a place that had begun to feel known. He looked up from the stove when she came in. His face did the thing she'd been watching it do for 6 months, the almost smile, the shift in the quality of his attention. Wine's breathing, he said, nodding toward the counter. She poured 2 glasses. She brought one to him. Their fingers touched on the stem, and neither of them moved for 1 second, 2, a third. Hello, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Hello. She stepped back and sat at the island and watched him cook, and they talked, not about work, not about the foundation discrepancy he was quietly investigating, not about any of the architecture of their usual context. He asked about her childhood, and she told him about Bridgeport and the hospital where her mother had been a nurse before she left. And she asked about Milan, where he'd gone to school for 2 years at 17, and he told her about it in a way she'd never heard him talk about anything, with the slight looseness of someone talking about something they'd loved before they learned to be careful. You were happy there, she said. For a while. He looked at his wineglass, and then my father— a pause. There was a situation at home. I came back. And you never went back? No. He looked at her. Some things you leave, and they close behind you. Some things don't close, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. Some things don't. After dinner, they stood at the eastern windows again. It had become their place, their particular geography, the lake below and the city behind, and the two of them between them. And she was looking at the dark water, and he was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and she felt the whole accumulated weight of the months between them, all the careful distances and the words not said, and the hands that had been half an inch apart and no closer. She turned. He was already looking at her. She had time to think, "Oh." And then he kissed her. It wasn't tentative. He was not a man who did things tentatively. It was the kiss of someone who had decided, and having decided, was fully present in the decision. One hand coming up to her face, the other at the small of her back, pulling her against him with the same controlled precision he brought to everything else, except that the control was in service of something entirely different now. She kissed him back. She put her hands against his chest, over his heart where she'd held them 3 days ago, and kissed him back with 6 months of careful management, releasing all at once. And it was the most honest thing she had ever done in this building. He pulled back after a long moment, though his hands didn't leave her. He looked at her, in the penthouse dark, the city light behind her, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, open, in the way that makes things vulnerable, real. "I've been deciding how to do this for months," he said, his voice lower than usual, quieter. "You've been deciding," she said, "for months." "Yes." "That seems like a long time." "Some decisions require that." He looked at her with the look, particularly when getting them wrong matters. She put her hand back against his chest, against the heart, which was still not entirely steady. "Does this feel wrong?" He looked down at her hand. "No," he said. "It feels like the first correct thing in a very long time." She breathed in slowly. She thought about the debt, still there, still a number. She thought about what Dante had said in the kitchen. She thought about a man who had spent 20 years building a fortress and had recently started leaving the door open in her direction. And she thought, "I am not going to hold the debt against this. This is mine. I earned it differently than he thinks, but I earned it." "Luca," she said. "Yes." "I need you to know something." He waited. He was good at waiting. "I'm not here for the debt anymore," she said. "I mean, I'll keep working. I'll fulfill the arrangement, but that's not why I'm staying." He looked at her with the quiet that was its own language. "I know," he said. "I need you to hear it from me." "I hear it." He brought his other hand up to her face, 2 hands now, framing her with the careful intentionality of everything he did. "I hear you, Mara." She let herself be held. Outside, Chicago in December, all cold and light. Inside, a fortress with a door open for the first time. She stayed until midnight. In the elevator going down, she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and smiled so hard it hurt. She let herself have it. She drove home through the winter city, and she let herself have every bit of it. The investigation into the foundation discrepancy resolved with the speed and completeness that characterized Luca's approach to internal problems, which is to say, quietly, finally, and in a way she wasn't entirely privy to. What she knew was that a man named Bertoli, a mid-level administrator in the Foundation's financial oversight arm, someone she'd met twice and remembered as unremarkable in the specific way of people who make themselves unremarkable deliberately, was no longer with the organization as of the second week of December. She knew this because his access credentials stopped working on a Wednesday, and by Thursday his desk had been cleared, and by Friday his name had been removed from the organizational chart with the seamlessness of someone excised rather than simply departed. She did not ask what had happened. She was operating by now in the understanding that there were categories of knowledge that were not hers, and that maintaining the boundary was both professionally appropriate and personally survivable. What she knew was her job. Her job was legitimate. The things that happened in the space her job did not occupy were not her responsibility. What she did ask on the Friday was, "Is it resolved?" Luca had looked up from his desk. They were in the penthouse office now more than the building. Another shift, she'd noted, the slow migration of his operational centre to the residential tower, a consolidation of his personal and professional space that she understood was partly about security and partly about something else. "Yes," he said. "Will it affect the Foundation's year-end filings?" "No, the amounts were recovered." She nodded. She went back to work. He watched her go back to work with an expression she caught in her peripheral vision, the new quality of it, the one that had been there since the Sunday with the kiss, the one that was warmer and more present, and also, she'd noticed, more watchful. As if now that he'd allowed himself to acknowledge what she was to him, the awareness of her had sharpened in every direction. She had her own version of the same thing. The problem came from Ferrante. She should have predicted it. Looking back, she would understand she'd had all the data. The pale eyes, the thwarted access, the smile that wasn't one. But the attack, when it came, was personal rather than physical, which was why it landed with the particular sting of things she hadn't prepared her armor for. She was at a client event, the annual Foundation Gala at the Drake, 150 people, an elegant occasion that was partly fundraising and partly the social layer of Luca's organizational world. She was there as his associate, a role that had been stretching its definition for months and had recently started implying something that wasn't purely professional. She wore a dress she'd chosen herself. Dark red, simple, a departure from her usual safe neutrals, and she was standing near the drink service when Ferrante appeared. He was with two other men. He looked at her with the pale-eyed assessment she'd clocked on their first meeting. He approached without invitation. "Miss Vasquez," he said. "Mr. Ferrante?" "It's extraordinary, isn't it?" he said. He had a glass of something amber and expensive. He had the ease of a man who had calculated the odds in this room and found them satisfactory. "The arrangement." She kept her expression neutral. "What arrangement is that?" "Daddy owes, daughter pays." He tilted his head. "I wonder what Luca's paying in return." The words were designed precisely, the way a blade is designed, for entry, for maximum damage given the angle. She felt them land. She took a breath. She looked at him with the equanimity of a woman who had stood in operating rooms and held people together. "Mr. Ferrante," she said, "if you have a concern about Mr. Ricci's professional arrangements, I'd encourage you to raise it with him." "I'm raising it with you," he said, pleasantly, "since you seem to be the primary beneficiary of his generosity." "Excuse me," she said, and turned and walked away, because continuing the conversation would give it weight, and it did not deserve weight. But she felt it. She stood by the window on the far side of the room and breathed, and felt the words doing what they were designed to do. Not in her sense of herself, because she knew her sense of herself, but in the vulnerable, unarmoured space that had opened in the last few weeks, the space she'd been building with Luca that was new and therefore more tender than the rest. She felt the doubt attempting to establish itself. "Is this?" it tried. "Is he?" She shut it down. She was practical. She was clear-eyed. She knew what she felt, and she knew, as much as it was possible to know anything in this world, what he felt. She was not going to let Nico Ferrante's pale eyes and calculated cruelty reach the thing she'd been building. But she was rattled. Enough that Luca noticed. He found her at the window an hour later, the event still in its elegant swing around them. "What happened?" he said low. "Ferrante." His jaw tightened in the specific way. What did he say? She told him, precisely, without embellishment, because that was how she did things. He was quiet for a moment that had a quality of compression she'd come to recognize. Then, "Look at me." She looked at him. "What you heard," he said, "has no truth in it. How you came to this arrangement has no bearing on what this is." He held her gaze. "You understand that?" "I know," she said. "Mara?" He said it with the specific weight. "Do you know that? Not analytically. Actually." She held his eyes. She thought about the kiss and the hands covering hers and the correct thing in a long time. She thought about months of accumulated evidence that this man, whatever else he was, did not perform what he did not mean. "Yes," she said. "I know it." Something released in his face. "Good." He reached out and touched the back of her hand. Brief, precise, the specific gesture that had become his, and then stepped back. "Ferrante won't be a problem." She believed him. After the event, in the car, he was quiet in a way that was different from usual. An active quiet, a thinking one. She let it sit. Then he said, "I'm sorry." She turned to look at him. In the passing light, the profile she had been reading for months. "The arrangement," he said, "the way it was constructed. It was correct from a business standpoint, and it was wrong in every other way. You didn't know. I should have seen sooner what it was becoming, what you were. I handled it with the tools I had, and those tools weren't sufficient." He looked out the window. "I want to discharge the debt." She went still. "The full amount?" "Yes." "Luca, the arrangement started one way. I want it to be what it is now, without that weight on it." He looked at her. "Your father's debt is forgiven." She sat with it. The number she'd been calculating for 6 months dissolving. The thing that had brought her to his door no longer a chain. She waited to feel relief and found something more complex. Something about what you are when the thing that defined your context ceases to exist. "And me?" she said. "What about you? Without the debt, what am I?" He looked at her with the open expression, the one she'd first seen on the Sunday 3 weeks ago, the one that was all him without the management. "Whatever you want to be," he said, "to me, in this." A pause. "I'm asking you to choose it, not because of what's owed, because you want it." She breathed. She looked at the city going by, all its winter light. "I already chose it," she said, "a long time ago." January came in hard and bright, the city under snow, the lake a frozen mirror, the world turned clean and cold. The debt was gone. The paperwork had been filed, an internal cancellation, handled with the same quiet efficiency Luca applied to everything he'd decided. And her father had called her, voice breaking slightly at the edges, with a gratitude that he hadn't been able to shape into words. Which was fine, because she hadn't needed words from him. She'd needed him to be safe. He was safe. She was still at Ricci Holdings. She was still at her desk every morning at 7, and her work was still the same work. Better now, because she had 8 months of context, and Luca had been systematically lifting the restrictions on what she could see, and therefore what she could manage. The job had grown. She had grown into it. What had also grown was the thing between her and Luca, though it grew in the specific way of something that is being built by two careful people who have both been shaped by the experience of things breaking. Slowly, with attention, without rushing. He didn't announce it. She didn't announce it. They were professional in the office, which meant the difference was observable only by those who already knew. Gloria, who said nothing but made an extra cup of tea some mornings and left it on Mara's desk with a satisfaction that was its own language. Dante, who expressed his approval by becoming, if possible, even warmer toward her and occasionally arriving with pastries. What the relationship looked like in private was different from what she'd expected, less dramatic than the months of tension leading to it, and in that way more real. He was attentive in the specific way of someone who had learned, through much effort, to make space for another person. He asked about her day and meant it. He remembered things she mentioned and referenced them later, proving the depth of the listening. He cooked. He read in the same room as her. On evenings she stayed at the penthouse, he would sit across from her while she worked on foundation documents, and he read. And the silence of those evenings had the warm density of a room that held two people comfortably. He was not without difficulty. He was still private in ways that had not changed because she was in his life. There were rooms she still wasn't in, conversations that went quiet when she appeared, a category of his world that remained opaque. She had decided, over the months of working adjacent to the line, that she could live with this, not because it didn't matter, but because she understood its origin, and because a man who had spent his life protecting the people he loved by keeping them separate from the parts of his world that were dangerous was not going to be able to transform that strategy quickly, and she did not want to be transformed quickly herself. She had her own rooms. On a Wednesday in January, she met Luca Ricci, Luca's aunt. The family member who had, from what she'd gathered, been the one to call when Dante was in the hospital, not Luca's call to make to her, but her call, arriving before he'd fully processed events, arriving with the authority of someone who had been present for all the family's histories. Elena was 70 and had the kind of face that faces spent in the observation of human nature tend to develop, fine-featured, amused, deeply seeing. She came to the penthouse on a Tuesday evening when Mara was there, and she met Mara the way you meet someone you've already formed an opinion of, with the testing phase complete. She sat across from Mara at the kitchen table while Luca made coffee with the slight over-carefulness of a man whose aunt's opinion matters, and she asked Mara about her work and her family and her education with the brisk thoroughness of a woman who considered efficiency in social assessment a virtue. Then she said, "Do you love him?" Mara looked at her, at Luca's back, at the stove. Yes, she said. The honesty was deliberate. She'd decided that the answer, in this room, from this woman, deserved nothing else. Elena looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Luca, who had not turned around but whose whole body had changed. A stillness that was different from his usual stillness. The stillness of someone who has heard something they needed. Good, Elena said. He's not easy. No, Mara agreed. He's worth it, Elena said, in case you were calculating. I stopped calculating a while ago, Mara said. Elena looked at her with the deep-seeing eyes. Yes, she said. I can tell. She picked up her coffee when Luca brought it. Sit down, Luca. You're making the room tense. He sat. I like her, Elena said to him, as if Mara were not present. Don't make a mess of it. I'm not planning to, he said. You never plan to. Men like you never plan to. It's the not planning that gets you. Elena sipped her coffee. She found your money leak, yes? Elena, Dante told me. He tells me everything. It's why God gave me Dante, to compensate for having given me you. She looked at Mara. He never tells me anything. It's exhausting. Mara kept her face professionally neutral and failed entirely when Dante, who had apparently been listening from the entry hall, arrived in the kitchen with a grin that occupied the full latitude of his face. I hear my name, he said. I was discussing your virtues, Elena said. Excellent. There are so many. Sit down, Luca said. So commanding, Dante said, sitting. The four of them sat around the kitchen table in the January evening, and Elena argued with Dante about something she'd read, and Luca listened with the slightly exasperated warmth that was his register for his family. And Mara watched them all, this complicated, close, difficult, specific family, and felt, settling over her like something that was taking up permanent residence, the shape of belonging. Not to the organization, not to the money or the power or the dangerous glamour of the world Ricci Holdings occupied, to the kitchen, to the table, to the particular warmth of these specific people who were, she understood now, something she was choosing on purpose every day. She looked at Luca. He was looking at her. He reached under the table and covered her hand with his. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She turned her hand over and held his. February. And then the past arrived. It came through the door in the shape of a man named Carlo Messina, and it came on a Thursday afternoon when the penthouse was quiet and she was alone in the office. Luca at a meeting downtown, Sal with him, the tower running on its usual internal rhythm. Carlo Messina was 60, silver-haired, elegantly dressed in the Italian manner, with the bearing of a man who had been significant in other rooms and expected that significance to travel with him. He arrived without an appointment, which was impossible. The building's security was not permeable, and yet here he was, which meant someone had let him in. She rose from her desk. "You must be Mara," he said, in English with Italian notes. He looked at her with an assessment that was thorough and not entirely professional. "Can I help you?" she said. "I'm an old friend of the Ricci family," he said. He sat in the chair across from her desk without being invited, which was a specific choice. "I'm here to see Luca." "Mr. Ricci is unavailable. Can I tell him you came by?" "Messina," he said. "Carlo Messina. He'll know the name." She kept her face neutral. She knew the name. She'd heard it in fragments over months, never directly addressed, always at the edge of conversations that quieted when she came near. Messina was a name from the family's history, from before Luca's management, from the time of his father. A name associated with the part of the architecture she didn't have access to. "I'll let him know," she said. "Tell him I need to discuss something about the Northern Agreement," Messina said. He looked at her steadily. "He'll understand." "I'll pass the message." He rose unhurriedly. He looked at the office, the space, her desk, the photographs of the city on the wall. "He keeps you very close," he said. It was not a compliment. "I do my job," she said. "Yes." He looked at her with the deep eyes of a man taking inventory. "I'm sure you do." He moved toward the elevator, paused. "Be careful, Miss Vasquez. The people closest to Luca have an unfortunate tendency to become leverage." He left. She stood in the quiet office and processed. Then she picked up her phone and called Luca. He was in her ear in 2 rings. She told him. She told him precisely, including Messina's last words, because precision was the only responsible thing when delivering this kind of information. There was a silence of approximately 4 seconds. "Don't leave the building," he said. "I'm coming back." He arrived in 40 minutes. She was at her desk. He came through the door with Sal and 2 men she'd seen before and hadn't been introduced to, and his face was the controlled one, the diamond-hard compression, and she rose when he came to her. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in September, when she'd come back from the street. The inventory, the assessment of damage that wasn't there. "You're all right," he said. "I'm fine. He didn't—" "I know." He exhaled slowly. "I know." He looked at Sal over his shoulder. "Give us the room." The other men filtered out. Sal last, door closed. Luca stood in the empty office. She'd seen this particular quality of him before, the aftermath of control, the moment after the compression, when the cost of it was briefly visible. "Messina is someone from my father's time," he said. He never volunteered information about the interior of the organization. He was volunteering it now. "He operated with my father for 15 years. After my father died, he went to other arrangements. We've had an understanding. The Northern Agreement he mentioned is a geographic boundary, a territorial line that's held for a decade. And now? And now he's here, in my space, making sure you know you're visible." He looked at her steadily. "Which means he's decided you're a pressure point." She held his gaze. "Is that a problem you can manage?" "Yes." "Then manage it." She said it simply, without drama. "I trust you to do that. I'm not asking you to explain how." He looked at her for a long moment, the full look, open and unguarded. "You're not afraid?" "I'm not afraid," she said, using the phrase she'd used the first night in her father's living room. "I just don't let fear make my decisions." He made a sound that was surprising, a breath of something that was almost a laugh, low and involuntary, the sound of a man hearing something that reached him. "I know," he said. "I remember." He reached out and took her hand. He held it, looking at it, her hand in his, the fingers, the familiar geography of a thing that had become important. "I need to ask you something." "Ask." He looked up. "How much of this can you live with?" She understood the question. It wasn't abstract. It was the direct asking of something she'd been knowing she'd need to answer since before she'd let herself admit to what she felt. The life, the real shape of it, the people in silver cars, the men like Messina, the rooms she wasn't in, the world she stood adjacent to. She thought about it honestly. She gave him the honest answer. "I can live with not knowing everything," she said. "I can live with the space where your world is and my world isn't. What I can't live with is being kept at the edge of my own life. What I can't live with is the thing we have being held in a different category from the rest of your reality, like it's separate from who you are." He listened. He did not look away. "I need to be," she searched for the word, "real to you, not in a category, not the thing you protect by keeping it apart. Real." "You are," he said. "I know. I need you to keep knowing it when things get complicated, which they will." "Yes," he said, "they will." "And I need you to talk to me," she said. "Not everything, not the things that aren't mine to know. But when it matters, when things affect us, I need to not be the last to know." He looked at her. He brought her hand up and held it against his jaw, a gesture she hadn't seen him make before, intimate and unguarded. "I'm not good at that," he said. "I know. I'm asking you to be better at it." A pause. "I'll try," he said. And from Luca Ricci she understood, "I'll try" was the same as a promise. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. They stood like that in the January afternoon, in the office where they'd built this thing between them, and the city spread out below in its enormous cold clarity. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said back. March. The Messina situation resolved in the way Luca's situations resolved, with the minimum of visible drama and the maximum of consequence. She didn't know exactly what happened. She knew it involved 2 days when Luca was largely unreachable. A trip, she gathered, was to New York, and a phone call she overheard enough of to understand was a final negotiation of terms. When he came back, he told her, "The Northern Agreement holds. Messina won't be coming to this building again." She accepted it. She understood the boundaries. What happened in March was something different, something that came not from outside the fortress, but from inside her. She'd been at Ricci Holdings for 9 months. She'd fallen in love in that time, acknowledging it now fully, not qualifying it. She'd become indispensable. She'd discharged a debt that was now ancient history. She'd built something with a man she hadn't expected to build anything with, and was still occasionally astonished at quiet moments by the specificity of what they had. She had also, in that time, stopped thinking about what came next for her. The long game. The version of her life before Bridgeport and the hospital and the debt. The version where she'd wanted things for herself, had a rough architecture of ambitions she'd set aside because there was never time or money or enough of either. She was thinking about it now. She was thinking about it because of a conversation with a woman named Dr. Sarah Park, who led the Foundation's Health Equity Initiative, and who had invited Mara to a committee meeting, not as an administrative presence, but as a contributor. A small distinction that had arrived without fanfare and settled into Mara's consciousness with the weight of something important. After the meeting, Sarah had said, "You have a policy mind. Have you ever considered going further with it?" Mara had said, "I have a business degree I've never used." Sarah had said, "There are programs. The Foundation sponsors some. If you're interested, I can send you information. She had said she'd think about it. She was thinking about it on a Sunday evening at the penthouse, reading, Luca across the room doing the same, when she looked up and said, "I want to go back to school." He looked up. "Health policy," she said. "There's a program at Northwestern. The foundation has a relationship with it." She said it all at once, the way she approached things she might otherwise hesitate over. "I don't want to leave my position. I think I can manage both, but I needed to say it." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his eyes, not surprise, not resistance, something that was closer to pleasure, the specific pleasure of a person watching someone they care about claim something for themselves. "Then you should apply," he said. "I'm not asking your permission." "I know," he said. "I'm not giving it." "I'm saying you should." A pause. "I'll write you a recommendation." She blinked. You've managed a multi-million-dollar foundation's administrative function for 9 months. You identified an internal financial breach that would have cost the foundation significantly. You restructured the entire administrative operation. He looked at her steadily. The recommendation would be factual. She held his gaze. She felt something shift inside her. Not the love, which was its own constant now, but something alongside it, a future that looked like hers in a way it hadn't for a long time. Not just his world, held adjacent to her own life, her world expanding. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She applied. 3 weeks later, walking through the penthouse with a letter in her hand, she stopped in the living room where Luca was on the phone. He looked up. She held up the letter. He read her face rather than the letter. She could see him doing it, the exact read. He ended the call. "Northwestern?" he said. "Admitted," she said, "with a partial scholarship." He stood. He crossed the room. He took the letter from her hand and looked at it, actually looked at it, reading, and she saw it on his face, a clean, genuine, unambiguous happiness for her, the expression of a man who had spent most of his life in zero-sum situations and was encountering a pure win. He looked up. "I'm proud of you," he said. It was the simplest sentence. It landed like the most complicated thing. She put her arms around him, not the gentle, tentative gesture of the early weeks, but the full embracing of someone who had decided and chosen and was home. And he held her back in the way he held her, which was completely, with the whole body, like something he'd been waiting to do for longer than she'd know. "Thank you," she said against his shoulder. "For what?" "For the letter. For the push." She pulled back and looked at him. "For keeping the arrangement just long enough that I found out what I was capable of." He looked at her with the open expression, the real one. "I kept the arrangement," he said, "because it was the only way I had to keep you close long enough to show you what you were to me." She breathed in slowly. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. "The honesty." "I know." She put her hand against his jaw. "I can see it." He turned his head slightly and pressed his mouth against her palm, a gesture so small and so specific and so entirely him that she felt it in the marrow of her. "You're staying," he said, not a question. "I'm staying," she said. Not because of the debt, not because of the arrangement, not because of anything except the truest possible version of "I want to." Outside, March was beginning to thaw. The city was making its annual argument for spring, putting forth the first green at the bases of trees, the light staying a little later each day. Inside the penthouse, they stayed like that for a long time. His arms around her, her hands against his face, the future between them taking up more room than the past. April. And then the worst thing. She'd known, abstractly, that it would come. You don't live adjacent to the edge of something sharp for 9 months without understanding that at some point the edge will be relevant in a way that isn't abstract. It came on a Tuesday, which was the particular insult of crises. They arrived in the middle of ordinary days, indifferent to preparation. She was at the penthouse office when Dante called her directly. Not Luca, not Sal. Dante, which was the first signal that the situation had already moved beyond normal channels. "Where are you?" he said, and his voice had none of its usual warmth, just the stripped-down directness of urgency. "Penthouse," she said. She was already standing. "Stay there. Don't leave. Don't open the door for anyone who doesn't use the secondary code. Do you know the secondary code?" She did. Luca had given it to her 3 months ago, casually as if it were a practical matter, and not also an indication of what category she occupied. "Yes," she said. "Good. I'm 20 minutes out." "Dante, Luca's fine," he said, answering the question she hadn't asked. "He's fine. He's dealing with something. I'll explain when I get there." He arrived in 18 minutes. He came in with Sal and 2 people she'd seen in the building's security function, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a man carrying the full weight of who he actually was. The warmth wasn't gone, but it had been joined by something she only occasionally glimpsed in him, the thing beneath the warmth, the part that was Luca's brother in every sense. "Tell me," she said. He told her. A situation that had been building, she'd been aware of it at the edges, the increased security, Luca's increased hours, the compressed quality of his attention that had returned over the last 2 weeks. A challenge to the organization, from within and without. The specific variety of crisis that happened when someone believed a moment of transition was an opportunity. Ferrante, she understood. Not directly stated, but the shape of it. "Is he hurt?" she said. "No, not yet." Dante looked at her. "He's managing it. It's going to be a long few days." "What do you need from me?" He blinked. Something in his face shifted, the specific micro-expression of a man encountering unexpected composure. "We need you to stay here where we can protect you. We need you to not contact anyone outside this building's secure line. We need you to trust us to handle this." "Okay," she said. "That's—" He stopped. "I expected more resistance." "I'm not helpless," she said, "and I'm not in the way. Let me know if you need me to do anything useful. Otherwise, I'll stay out of your way and work." She held his gaze. "And Dante, when this is done, I need to talk to both of you about the structural things, about what I can and can't know going forward, because this is not how I want to find out things are happening." He looked at her for a long moment. "Fair," he said. The 3 days were long. Luca called twice, brief, clipped, the calls of a man managing multiple things while maintaining contact because he understood the contact mattered. She heard his voice and said she was fine, and he said he knew, and the calls ended. She worked. She stayed. She did not perform distress. When he came back on the 3rd night, she was awake. It was 1 a.m. She'd been reading, and she heard him come in, and she came out to the living room, and he stopped in the entryway, and looked at her, and she could see the 3 days on him. She crossed the room. She put her arms around him without words. He held her, arms tight around her, face against her hair, and she felt him exhale, slowly, completely, the full release of someone who has been held at tension for 72 hours and has finally reached the place where they can let it go. They stood like that for a long time. Finally, he said, muffled, "I'm sorry." "Don't," she said. "I should have. Don't." She pulled back enough to see his face. He looked tired. He looked human, in the way she got to see, and not everyone did. "It happened. You handled it. You kept me safe." She held his face. "What happened to Ferrante?" He looked at her. "He's no longer a problem." She understood what that meant. She filed it in the space she kept such understanding. She did not ask more. "And you?" she said. "Are you all right?" He looked at her with the expression, the open one, the real one. "I am now," he said. She took his hand and led him to the kitchen, because this was what she did. She brought people to warmth when they were cold, to food when they'd forgotten to eat, to the ordinary when the extraordinary had consumed them. She made tea because she was not Italian and did not always reach for wine, and he sat at the kitchen counter and watched her with the eyes of a man who was learning, day by day, what it meant to have someone in his corner. "I need to tell you things," he said. "Not tonight," she said. "Mara, not tonight." She put the tea in front of him. "Tonight you drink this and sleep. Tomorrow you tell me what I should know." She looked at him. "In the morning, all of it." He looked at the tea. He looked at her. He reached out and covered her hand on the counter with both of his. "In the morning," he said. They sat in the kitchen with the city asleep around them and the April night quiet outside the windows. And she thought, this is it. Not the romance, not the tension, not the slow burn of the months before. This. The kitchen at 1 a.m. and the tea and the tiredness and the trust. This was the actual thing. The real substance of what they were building. She was keeping it. All of it. May. The city in its fullness. The lake turned blue again, the streets alive, the long light of late spring stretching the evenings into something luxurious. 1 year since a woman in scrubs had walked into her father's living room and heard the number that would change her life. She thought about that woman sometimes, the one who had stood with her hand flat against the elevator wall, counting to get her pulse under control. The one who had told herself she'd feel nothing and had failed from the first week. The one who had been so careful and so practical and so determined not to let what was happening to her heart affect the management of everything else. She thought about her with tenderness and without condescension. That woman had been right to be careful. The world she'd walked into had required exactly that, the caution, the precision, the refusal to let herself become unmoored. All of it had been necessary. And then it had been possible to put the caution down. That was the part she hadn't seen coming, not the falling, which she'd prepared against, but the putting down, the discovery that you can be careful and then be done being careful, and both are right at the moment they happen. She was at her desk, the penthouse office desk, which had been her primary workspace since December, when Luca came in. He had something in his hand. He set it on her desk. It was a document. She looked at it. Ricci Foundation, Director of Operations. Her name. She looked up. He was standing on the other side of her desk with the expression she loved most. Not the controlled one, not the open one, but the one she'd started seeing recently. The one that combined both. The man who had control and had chosen, in her presence, to set it down, together in the same moment. "This requires your acceptance," he said. "It's a position, not an assignment. You'd have full authority over the Foundation's operational function. It's separate from your current role with me." A pause. "Meaning it exists whether or not we—" "I know what it means," she said. "I want you to have it because you've earned it," he said, "not because of anything else." She looked at the document. Her name, Director of Operations. She thought about Dr. Sarah Park and the committee meeting and the question about her policy mind. She thought about Northwestern starting in September. She thought about the woman in scrubs and the number 230,000 and everything that had happened since. She looked up. "What am I to you?" she asked. She'd asked him this once before, in December, in this office, on the day everything had shifted. He'd said he didn't have a word he could bring himself to say. He held her gaze. "Everything," he said. No qualification, no condition. The word like a stone placed with the full intention of permanence. She breathed in. She stood. She came around the desk. She stopped in front of him and looked up, and he looked down, and between them was the whole year. The first night, and the first morning, and the office, and the kitchen, and the penthouse, and the fear, and the trust, and all the things that had been built carefully between two people who had not expected to build anything. "I love you," she said. She'd said it once before, to herself, in the car on the way home from the Lake Forest house, quietly, like something she'd confirmed. She'd never said it to him. She said it now, with the same precision and the same calm of a person who has finished processing and arrived at a clear answer. He looked at her. She watched it move through him, the word, the weight of it, the particular impact of a thing said directly and completely by a person he'd been careful to deserve. "I know," he said, which was not quite what she expected. "I've known for a while." She almost laughed. "And you didn't say anything?" "I was waiting to be certain that what I felt in return was equal. That I could say it and mean the full weight of it." He reached out and took her face in his hands, both hands, the careful, deliberate gesture that was entirely him. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since before I was ready to understand what that meant for a man like me." She covered his hands with hers. "A man like you," she said. "A man who has built everything around not needing things," he said, "and then needed something." "Someone," she said. "Someone," he agreed. She kissed him. He kissed her back. The city outside in its May abundance, the lake visible through the windows in its full spring blue, the world going on around them with its ordinary, beautiful noise. When they separated, she stayed close, hands against his chest, the familiar position. "The foundation position," she said. "Yes." I accept. Good. His hands were still at her face. Northwestern in September. Yes. You'll need to adjust your hours. We'll manage. We'll manage, he agreed, and said it in a way that was not logistical. She smiled. She felt it fully, not managed, not contained. She let the smile be exactly what it was. 1 year ago, she said, I walked into my father's living room. Yes. I walked in to pay a debt. Yes. His eyes were on her face with the look she loved, the complete, undivided presence of it. I want you to know, she said, that I don't think about it that way anymore. I haven't for a long time. What I walked into wasn't a debt. He waited. It was my life, she said, arriving in a form I didn't recognize. He breathed, a long, slow breath, the kind that's not about oxygen. Yes, he said quietly. That's what it was. They stood at the window where they always stood, the lake below them, the city breathing around them. She thought about the first night in her father's house, and the rain, and the number, and the cold eyes that had, over months, warmed. She thought about every increment of the warming. She thought about the value of all of it. The debt was gone. It had dissolved in the chemistry of everything they'd built on top of it. Not something she'd paid off, but something she'd transformed. The raw material of obligation converted by 12 months of two careful people finding each other in the middle of a world that was neither safe nor simple. She was still here. She was choosing to be here. That was the only math that mattered now. Later, much later, she would try to explain it to a version of herself, the one who had stood in the elevator, pressing her hand against the wall, counting. She would try to explain that what had felt like walking into someone else's world had turned out to be walking into her own. That the man who had seemed to belong to a different category of human, colder, more controlled, operating in a register she couldn't entirely reach, had turned out to be, in all the ways that counted, the specific person she'd been moving toward. That what had felt like a sentence had been, in every way that mattered, a beginning. She would try to explain it, but the woman in the elevator, pressing her palm flat against the wall, already knows. She's counting. She's getting her pulse under control. She's walking toward the door. Outside the door is the rest of her life. She goes in.